My father always hated me. I ran and found refuge in God, but it led to the death of my closest friend's faith. If you grew up in a house where you were unwanted, you learn to sense it everywhere, not just in words, but in every sideways look and in the silence that falls after you enter a room. My earliest memories are full of my dad's impatience, the way he would sigh as soon as I opened my mouth, the way he seemed disappointed by everything I did, even before I did anything at all. My mom tried to smooth things over, acting like nothing was wrong, but there were nights I could hear her crying softly in the kitchen, and I knew it was because of me. I was never the son my dad wanted. I didn't like sports, I wasn't loud or tough, and I always felt more comfortable alone with my thoughts than around other people. As soon as I turned 13, my dad stopped trying to hide it. He started calling me weak and said I was just like my mother, and to him, that was the worst thing a person could be. I used to try to win his approval, working extra hard in school, joining the track team even though I hated running, pretending to laugh at his mean jokes, but nothing ever changed. No matter what I did, I was invisible to him unless I made a mistake. When I turned 17, things at home got worse, not better. My dad lost his job at the warehouse, and suddenly every small problem became a big one. He'd come home angry, blaming everyone but himself for the way things turned out, and I became his favorite target. If I left a cup in the sink or forgot to take out the trash, he'd blow up, shouting that I was lazy and useless and that I'd never amount to anything. My mom tried to stand up for me, but after a while, she gave up, worn down by years of the same arguments. I think she started to believe him too, or maybe she just wanted to keep the peace. I started spending more time outside, riding the city bus until it got dark, sitting in the park with headphones on, or wandering the aisles of the 24-hour supermarket just so I wouldn't have to go home. Even then, I still hoped that if I just tried harder, things would change. The night everything finally fell apart started out like any other. I came home late from work. My job at the grocery store stocking shelves had gone longer than usual. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. My dad was sitting at the table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, watching the news with the volume turned up too loud. My mom was nowhere in sight, probably hiding in her bedroom pretending to sleep. I tried to sneak past him, but he called me over and started in about how I was an embarrassment, that he didn't want me living in his house if I couldn't even respect his rules. I tried to keep my mouth shut, but when he started insulting my mom, something inside me snapped. For the first time in my life, I talked back, telling him he had no right to treat either of us like that. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit me. He didn't, but he got right in my face, shouting that if I didn't like it, I could leave and see how long I lasted on my own. That was the moment I realized he didn't care if I stayed or left. He actually wanted me gone. I didn't even pack a bag. I just grabbed my phone, wallet, and jacket and walked out the front door without looking back. It was late, and the streets were empty except for a few cars passing by. I had nowhere to go and no one to call, but I kept walking anyway, partly because I was afraid he'd come after me and partly because I didn't want to break down in front of the house. I ended up downtown near the river, sitting on a bench under a broken streetlight, watching the water and trying to figure out what to do next. My phone was almost dead, and I only had $26 left from my last paycheck. I thought about calling Ben, the only real friend I had at school, but it was almost midnight, and I didn't want to drag him into my problems. I spent that first night outside, shivering in my thin jacket, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and sirens and thinking about how easily things can fall apart. I watched the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold and told myself I'd figure something out as soon as the city woke up. The next morning, I went to the public library to charge my phone and try to get warm. I searched for shelters nearby, but every place I called was either full or wouldn't take someone under 18 without a parent. I started to feel desperate, but I knew I couldn't go back home. I spent the rest of the day wandering the city, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Around noon, I ducked into a little church on the corner of Maple and 3rd, mostly because it was open and I needed a place to sit. I didn't expect anything, but the stained glass windows and the quiet made me feel safer than I'd felt in months. That's where I met Pastor Mark, who was setting up for a food drive in the basement. He looked surprised to see me, but he didn't ask a lot of questions. He just offered me a sandwich and said I could help if I wanted. I ended up spending the afternoon stacking boxes and talking to a few other volunteers, mostly older women from the neighborhood and a guy around my age named Ben. When I realized it was the same Ben from my high school math class, I almost laughed. We weren't close back then, but we'd sat together at lunch a few times, and he always seemed like the kind of person who could make friends with anyone. That afternoon, though, he seemed quieter, like he was carrying around his own invisible weight. We didn't talk much about why I was there or what had happened, but he invited me to come back for youth group that Friday, saying there'd be free pizza and games. I told him I'd think about it, but the truth was, I had nowhere else to go. I spent the next 2 nights in the church basement, with Pastor Mark's permission. I cleaned up, helped out with chores, and tried to keep my mind off everything I'd lost. The church wasn't fancy. Peeling paint on the walls, water stains on the ceiling, old hymnals with pages falling out, but it was warm, and nobody asked me questions I didn't want to answer. I started to notice things I'd never paid attention to before, like the way the morning light came through the stained glass, or the way everyone prayed for each other, even if they barely knew each other's names. I wasn't sure I believed in God yet, but there was something peaceful about being there, something that made the chaos in my head feel a little quieter. That Friday, I went to youth group mostly because Ben asked again. There were maybe a dozen of us, sitting in a circle eating pizza and talking about our weeks. Ben led a game that made everyone laugh, and for the first time in forever, I forgot about how bad things were at home. Later, when the group was over, Ben asked me if I was okay. I almost lied, but something in his voice made me tell the truth. He didn't judge me or offer advice. He just listened and told me he was glad I came. That night, lying on a cot in the church basement, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, like I was finally safe, but also completely lost. I prayed quietly, not even sure if anyone was listening, but hoping that somehow things would start to make sense. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of everything. My escape, my faith, and eventually, the pain I never saw coming. In the weeks that followed, I began to build a new routine around the church, trying to hold on to whatever stability I could find. Pastor Mark made it clear I was welcome for as long as I needed, and I paid my way by helping set up chairs, mopping the basement floor, and hauling boxes for the food pantry. I still missed my mom, and there were moments when guilt would hit me out of nowhere, but I pushed it down and tried to focus on what was in front of me. School was a different story, since showing up looking tired and wearing the same clothes got people talking, but I made a point of staying out of trouble, keeping my head down, and sitting at the back of every classroom. The only place I felt halfway normal was youth group, where Ben made sure nobody messed with me and always had a dumb joke ready, no matter how bad my day had been. One Sunday morning, Ben convinced me to go to the main service. I remember walking in late, still half asleep, feeling totally out of place in a crowd of people in nice clothes and shiny shoes. Pastor Mark's sermon was about forgiveness, about letting go of old hurts even when the other person never apologized. I kept thinking about my dad, how angry he would get if he knew I was here, sitting in a pew with my hands folded, pretending I belonged. After the service, a woman named Ms. Ruth came over and pressed a 20 into my hand, saying she remembered what it was like to be young and hungry. I thanked her, but I felt ashamed, wishing I could just disappear instead of needing handouts from strangers. That afternoon, Ben and I walked around the block, talking about nothing and everything, and for a while, I felt like maybe I was just a regular kid again. Ben had always been the kind of person who looked for the good in everyone, even when it wasn't obvious. He told me that his family didn't have much money either, but they stuck together, and that was what mattered. His dad worked nights as a janitor at the high school, and his mom cleaned houses during the day, so he was used to taking care of himself. I admired how he didn't seem embarrassed about it, how he could joke about eating cereal for dinner or wearing the same hoodie for a week straight. We'd sit in the back of the sanctuary during open prayer, sometimes not saying anything, just listening to the sounds of people asking for help. I started to feel like maybe faith wasn't just for people with perfect lives, that maybe there was room for someone like me. As time passed, I started sleeping better. I signed up for a GED prep course that the church offered on Wednesday nights, determined not to let my dad be right about me being a failure. I found a part-time job cleaning offices after school, saving every paycheck in a shoebox I kept hidden behind the hymnals in the basement. On weekends, Ben and I helped out with the food drives, sometimes making deliveries to families who had less than we did. There was something about handing a box of groceries to a stranger and seeing the look of relief on their face that made me feel useful for the first time in my life. For the first time in months, I wasn't scared of the future, and I started to believe that maybe things could really change. Even so, I couldn't completely shake the fear that my dad would show up one day, demanding I come home or threatening to drag me back. There were a few close calls, like the time I spotted his old pickup truck parked outside the school, or when Pastor Mark got a phone call from someone asking if I'd been seen at the church. Pastor Mark always handled it calmly, telling me I was safe and that I didn't have to talk to anyone I didn't want to. I knew my mom worried about me, and every once in a while, I'd get a message from an unknown number that I was sure was her. I missed her, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out, afraid of what my dad might say if he found out. Ben became my anchor through all of this, someone who listened without judging, who made even the worst days a little bit easier. We started hanging out outside of church, going to cheap matinees at the Dollar Theater or spending hours at the skate park even though neither of us could really skate. We'd sit on the curb with slices of pizza, talking about everything from music to what we'd do if we ever got out of this town. It was Ben who first talked to me about faith in a real way, not just repeating what the pastor said, but admitting he didn't have all the answers. He told me he'd started coming to church after his grandma died, hoping to find some peace. Sometimes he found it, sometimes he didn't. It was because of Ben that I got more involved in the church. We started volunteering at the youth center, running games for the little kids and helping set up for events. I started to see how much people relied on each other in a place like this, how every small act of kindness mattered. For my birthday, Ben bought me a cheap Bible from the thrift store, scribbling a dumb joke inside the cover that made me laugh every time I opened it. I started reading it at night, circling the parts that made sense and scribbling questions in the margins for Pastor Mark. Slowly, my prayers stopped feeling forced. Instead of just begging for things to get better, I found myself grateful for the small things, a meal, a place to sleep, a friend who cared. But good things have a way of getting complicated, and it didn't take long for life to throw something new at us. One Friday night, Ben didn't show up to youth group, and when I texted, he didn't answer. The next day, Emily, his girlfriend, came looking for me at the church. She was crying, and it took a while for her to get the words out, but when she did, my stomach dropped. Ben's dad had collapsed at work the night before, and by the time they got to the hospital, it was too late. I couldn't believe it. I'd seen him just a few days before, laughing with Ben in the parking lot, joking about the lousy coffee in the break room. Suddenly, everything felt unreal, like we were trapped in someone else's nightmare. Ben stopped coming to church after that. I tried to give him space, but after a week, I went to his house, knocking until his mom finally let me in. Ben looked different, older, somehow, with circles under his eyes and a flatness in his voice I'd never heard before. He said he didn't want to talk about it, that he just needed time, but I could see he was struggling. I offered to pray with him, but he just shook his head. I left that day feeling helpless, wishing I knew how to help him carry the weight he was suddenly holding. I spent that night praying harder than I ever had, asking God to give Ben some kind of comfort, to show him that he wasn't alone. In the weeks that followed, I kept checking in on Ben, leaving him notes at his door or sending stupid memes to make him laugh. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't. Emily tried to help too, but Ben started pushing her away, skipping school, and spending whole days alone in his room. At church, people asked about him, and I made excuses, telling them he was just tired, that he'd be back soon. Deep down, I started to worry he might never come back, that the pain was too big and the answers too far out of reach. Pastor Mark reminded me that sometimes all you can do is show up and let someone know you care, but I hated how useless that sounded when Ben was hurting so much. Through all of this, I clung to my faith harder than ever, telling myself that if I just believed enough, things would work out for both of us. I started volunteering for every shift, joining prayer groups, and reading scripture late into the night. There were nights I'd lie awake, staring at the cracks in the basement ceiling, wondering if I'd ever be able to make things right for Ben. I wanted so badly for him to find the same peace I'd found, to see that even in the darkest times, there could be hope. I didn't realize yet how much that hope would be tested, or how powerless I'd feel when the answers I wanted didn't come. As the winter stretched on, the days started to blend together, each one gray and cold, but somehow church became even more important to me. I was working harder than ever, stacking chairs for Sunday service and helping Pastor Mark with whatever odd jobs needed to be done. There was a kind of comfort in the repetition, in knowing what to expect when everything else in my life felt so unpredictable. I tried to focus on schoolwork and my job, but Ben was never far from my thoughts. I found myself glancing at my phone in every quiet moment, hoping for a message that never came, growing more anxious as the weeks dragged on. Emily called sometimes, mostly to ask if I'd heard from Ben or to vent about how he wouldn't answer her texts either. But there wasn't much I could say that would make her feel any better. We both knew Ben was slipping further away from us, and neither of us knew how to stop it. One afternoon, I finally saw Ben at the edge of the skate park, sitting on the concrete steps with his hood pulled up and his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I walked over, unsure if he'd want to see me, but he didn't tell me to go away. We sat in silence for a while, watching a group of little kids try to ollie over a tipped-over trash can. Eventually, he started talking, voice quiet and flat, telling me how empty everything felt, how nothing mattered since his dad died. He said he tried to pray, but it just made him feel stupid, like he was talking to nobody. I listened, not sure what to say, but when he started to cry, I just sat next to him and put my arm around his shoulders, feeling more like a brother than a friend. That was the first time I realized that sometimes presence mattered more than words, that just being there could mean something even if I didn't have answers. After that, I tried to keep showing up for Ben, even when he pushed me away. I invited him to youth group, to movie nights at the church, and to late-night walks along the river, but most of the time he just shook his head or said he was busy. I wanted so badly to help him find his way back to the faith we'd once shared, but I didn't know how to reach him anymore. The more I tried, the more it seemed like I was driving him further away. He started skipping school, barely answering his phone, and by spring he'd stopped coming to the church entirely. I could see the worry in Pastor Mark's eyes whenever he asked if I'd seen Ben, and Ms. Ruth always included him in her prayers, but none of it seemed to reach him. Emily eventually gave up, telling me through tears that she couldn't handle being shut out anymore, and that she needed to take care of herself for once. I didn't blame her, but I hated the way everything seemed to be unraveling around us. My own faith became almost desperate during that time, as if I believed that if I just prayed hard enough, Ben would find his way back. I started reading every book Pastor Mark recommended, going to every Bible study, and volunteering for every possible task. I thought if I filled my days with enough good deeds, God would notice and reward me by saving my friend from drowning in grief. Some nights, I would sneak into the sanctuary after everyone had gone home, kneeling at the altar under the cold light of the stained glass windows, begging God for a sign or a miracle, anything that would bring Ben some peace. There were nights I felt a strange kind of calm, as if someone was listening, but mostly I just felt tired, like I was chasing something I could never quite catch. Eventually, my obsession with saving Ben started to take a toll on my own life. I missed shifts at work, let my grades slip, and started snapping at people who only wanted to help. Pastor Mark pulled me aside one afternoon and told me gently that I couldn't carry someone else's pain forever, that sometimes faith meant letting go, but I didn't want to hear it. I felt responsible for Ben, convinced that I'd brought him to the church and that I needed to help him find his way back. It felt like a test, and I was failing every day that he drifted further away. Even when I forced myself to take a break and hang out with other people from church, I found myself watching the door, hoping Ben might walk in at the last minute and surprise us all. When I did see Ben, he looked thinner, shadows under his eyes, his hair growing longer than I'd ever seen it. He never smiled anymore, and his voice had a bitterness I barely recognized. One afternoon, after school let out, he showed up at the church while I was sweeping the front steps. He stood there for a long time before finally telling me he didn't want to talk about God or church or prayer, that it all felt fake to him now, like a game people played to avoid facing the truth. He said he didn't understand how I could still believe when so much bad stuff kept happening, that he envied my faith but couldn't find it in himself anymore. I tried to explain how faith wasn't about having all the answers, that it was about holding on even when things didn't make sense, but he cut me off, saying it was easy for me to believe because I'd found something worth holding on to. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there and let him talk, listening to all the anger and pain he'd been carrying alone. After that conversation, I started to realize that my efforts to save Ben might be making things worse, that maybe what he needed wasn't answers or lectures or prayers, but someone who would sit with him in the dark and let him be angry without trying to fix it. I started backing off a little, not because I stopped caring, but because I didn't want to push him any further away. I focused on my job, on my classes, and on rebuilding my relationship with my mom, who had started sending me cautious messages asking if I was okay. I wrote back, telling her bits and pieces of my life, and she always replied with the same worry in her words, but at least it felt like a start. Sometimes I caught glimpses of my dad in town, driving his old truck past the grocery store or standing in line at the gas station, but he never tried to talk to me, and I never tried to talk to him. I started to accept that Ben might never come back to church, that our friendship would look different now, shaped by the pain and confusion that neither of us could control. I tried to keep hope alive, to believe that God was still listening even when nothing made sense. Some nights, I would sit on the church steps, staring at the sky and talking to Ben in my head, wishing things could go back to the way they were before his dad died. But deep down, I knew things would never be the same, that sometimes faith is about surviving the silence as much as the answers. I learned to let go, not out of resignation, but because I loved Ben enough to let him walk his own path, even if it led him away from everything we used to share. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was the only way I could keep from losing myself in the process. The last weeks of school arrived with that strange heaviness that comes when you know one part of your life is ending and another is waiting, but you can't see past the door. I spent most mornings exhausted, staying up too late working my office cleaning job or tossing in the church basement, mind racing with memories and regrets. My phone would buzz sometimes with messages from my mom, short check-ins, little updates about the house or the neighbor's dog, or how she was thinking of me, but I never responded right away. Each message reminded me of what I'd lost, of the home that never really felt like mine, and the father who seemed to be shrinking even from a distance. I saw Frank around town more often now, his shoulders hunched, moving slower than I remembered, always alone. I wondered sometimes if he missed me or if I was just another failure to him, one more reason to drink and disappear. Church remained my anchor, though some days I showed up just out of habit. Pastor Mark's sermons began to hit differently as I got older, more aware of my own contradictions and flaws. There was one Sunday when he talked about forgiveness again, but this time he spoke about how sometimes forgiveness isn't for the person who hurt you. It's something you do to let go of the pain you carry. I listened from my usual spot in the back row, replaying every argument with my dad, every moment I'd wished for him to change, and wondering if it was possible to let go without ever getting the apology I wanted. Ben still wasn't coming to church, and Emily had stopped asking about him. I tried not to blame her, since I knew how much it hurt to watch someone you care about vanish into their own darkness. One humid afternoon, I was sweeping the church steps when Ms. Ruth hurried over, worry written all over her face. She told me she'd seen my father at the pharmacy, looking even worse than usual, and that he was coughing so hard she was afraid he might collapse. I thanked her, promising I'd check in, though inside I was full of dread. That night, as I was cleaning offices, my mom called. Her voice was shaky and tight, and she told me Frank had been admitted to the hospital after collapsing at work. She said he'd been coughing up blood, that the doctors were worried, and that she didn't know what to do. For a few seconds I felt like a little kid again, terrified and helpless, but then I realized she was asking me to come, that maybe after all this time my family needed me again. I barely slept that night. I walked the empty streets, rehearsing what I'd say to my father if he even wanted to see me. I was angry at him, still raw from everything he'd put me through, but I was also scared of losing him without ever finding some kind of closure. Early the next morning, I made my way to the hospital, heart pounding, stomach in knots. My mom met me in the lobby, looking older and smaller than I remembered, her eyes red from crying. She hugged me, holding on tight, and for a second all the years of silence and hurt melted away, replaced by a wave of relief and guilt. She led me to Frank's room, where he lay hooked up to machines, looking impossibly frail and unfamiliar. I stood at the door, unable to move, until my mom gently nudged me forward and told me he'd asked for me. The conversation with my father was nothing like I imagined it would be. He was tired, voice raspy and thin, but for the first time in my life, he seemed to see me. He apologized, not with grand speeches or tears, but with a shaky whisper that he knew he'd done things wrong, that he wished he could take some of it back. I sat beside him, stunned and unsure, searching his face for the anger I expected but finding only regret. I told him I forgave him, not because I thought it would fix everything, but because I needed to let go of the bitterness eating me alive. We talked about nothing and everything. The weather, my job, the way he used to love fishing before work swallowed him whole. When he drifted off to sleep, my mom and I walked outside and sat on the curb together, silent and side by side. I realized I still loved them, despite all the pain, and that maybe there was still time to start over, even if it would never be perfect. During those days at the hospital, I tried reaching out to Ben again, texting and calling, hoping he might pick up. I wanted to tell him what I'd learned, how forgiveness didn't mean pretending things were okay, but letting yourself breathe again. But Ben stayed silent, his phone always going to voicemail. I started leaving longer messages, rambling about my dad, about faith and anger and how scared I was, hoping maybe he'd hear something in my voice that would help. I saw Emily once in the grocery store, her hair pulled back and eyes tired. She asked about Ben, but I had nothing new to share. We stood there in the frozen food aisle, two people holding on to someone who kept slipping away, and for a moment it felt like everything in the world was moving except us. Frank's health declined fast. Each visit, he looked smaller, his breathing rougher, but he always asked about me and even about the church. One evening, he said he wished he could start over, that he was proud of me for surviving, for making something of myself when he had given me so little. Hearing those words broke something open in me, and I started to cry right there in his hospital room, not caring who saw. My mom sat beside us, rubbing my back, tears running down her cheeks too. In that moment, I knew I would never get back the years I'd lost, but I could still make peace with the pieces that remained. I prayed with him, quietly, and for the first time, my father didn't pull away or scoff. He just closed his eyes and listened, letting my words wash over the bitterness he'd carried for so long. After Frank died, the funeral was small, just family, a few old friends, and some co-workers from the warehouse. Pastor Mark gave a simple eulogy, talking about how everyone carries wounds and how sometimes healing comes too late. I saw Ben standing at the edge of the cemetery, hands shoved deep in his pockets, face hidden under a ball cap. I walked over, heart pounding, and stood beside him in silence. He finally spoke, voice thick, telling me he was sorry about my dad. I told him it still didn't feel real, that everything was happening too fast, and that I wasn't sure what came next. Ben admitted that he'd been angry for so long he didn't know how to let it go, that he was tired of pretending he was okay when he wasn't. I told him that was all right, that I loved him anyway, and that he didn't have to believe or pretend for my sake. We stood together in that quiet, windy cemetery, two friends who had lost more than we could say. I didn't push him to come back to church, didn't offer any empty promises or prayers he didn't want. I just listened, holding on to our shared history and the knowledge that even if faith looked different for each of us, it was still real in its own way. Walking away from the cemetery, I realized that forgiveness isn't a moment, but a slow unfolding, a decision you make again and again, even when it's hard. I missed my father, even with all the pain, and I missed the version of Ben who used to laugh at dumb jokes and believe the world was full of possibilities. But I also understood that love means letting go when you need to, and holding on when you can. For the first time in a long while, I felt something like peace. I knew the next chapter of my life would be written by my own choices, not by the pain of the past. The days after my father's funeral felt strangely quiet, as if some part of me expected another storm, but only found the slow rhythm of grief settling in. My mom moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, taking what little she could carry and leaving behind the house that held more pain than comfort. I visited her sometimes, bringing groceries or just sitting with her at the tiny kitchen table, talking about nothing and everything. We never said it out loud, but I think we both understood that what remained between us was fragile and precious, a chance to start again, even with so much unsaid. There was a time when I thought forgiveness meant erasing the past, pretending none of it happened, but now I saw it as a kind of quiet bravery, the willingness to keep loving despite the scars. At the church, things shifted too. Pastor Mark noticed I wasn't volunteering as much, and when he asked if I was okay, I told him the truth. I said I was tired, worn down from trying to hold everyone together, and unsure what faith was supposed to look like now. He didn't offer a solution or a verse to fix things. He just sat beside me in the pew, letting the silence say what words couldn't. I realized then that even in faith communities, people lose their way, that nobody expects you to be strong all the time. I found myself drawn more to the simple moments. Ms. Ruth bringing fresh muffins for Sunday coffee, Jessie teaching the little kids to play guitar, the way the lights slanted through the stained glass as the choir practiced in the afternoon. These small things felt like reminders that healing comes in pieces, not all at once, and that sometimes hope looks like just showing up, even when you're not sure what you believe anymore. My relationship with Ben stayed complicated, marked by long stretches of silence and sudden, unexpected conversations that always seemed to happen when we needed them most. There was a night a few weeks after the funeral when he showed up outside the church as I was locking up. He didn't say much, just asked if I wanted to walk, and we wandered the dark streets for hours, talking about anything but the things that hurt the most. I could feel the space between us, the places where trust and belief had been bruised, but I also felt a quiet kind of loyalty, a bond built from all the years we'd survived together. Ben admitted he didn't know if he'd ever come back to faith, that he still felt angry and lost most days, but that he was grateful I hadn't given up on him. I told him I'd stop trying to change his mind, that I just wanted him to know he wasn't alone, no matter where he ended up. It wasn't the resolution I'd prayed for, but it felt honest, and maybe that was enough. Sometimes I thought about all the ways my story could have turned out differently if I'd stayed home, or if Ben's dad hadn't died, or if my father had learned to love us sooner. But real life isn't built on maybes or clean answers. It's made up of messy choices, small moments of courage, and the faith to keep going even when nothing makes sense. I still prayed, but my prayers were less about asking for miracles and more about finding the strength to forgive, to let go, and to keep loving people even when it hurt. I realized that faith isn't just about believing everything will work out the way you want. It's about staying, about trying again, and about holding on to hope even when it feels impossibly far away. Years from now, I know I'll look back and see the ways pain shaped me into someone softer, someone who understands that healing and loss walk side by side. My father's apology didn't erase the past, and Ben's struggles didn't have a simple answer, but I learned to find meaning in the questions, not just the solutions. I still go to church most Sundays, sometimes sitting in the back row, sometimes standing up front to help with the food drive, always grateful for the community that caught me when I had nowhere else to go. My faith is quieter now, less desperate, but maybe deeper for it. In the end, I lost my friend's faith and found my own peace. Learned that love doesn't always save you in the ways you hope, but gives you the courage to keep showing up. I think of Ben every day, still rooting for him, still believing in the possibility of redemption, even if it doesn't come in the way I imagined. Life moves forward, slowly and with a kind of gentle persistence, and I keep going, not because I have all the answers, but because somewhere along the way, I learned that hope is reason enough to try again.